Well, hey, this morning we are, like I said, going to continue to just go through the Gospel of Luke. And so in this series, we call it The Life of the Party. And so just a little recap of where we've been. We've seen Jesus be a friend of sinners. And so that was about 4 weeks ago, I guess, when Marty came and preached that message, which was super encouraging. And then after that, we saw Jesus is the bridegroom of the wedding. And so we saw that, and our college pastor, Stephen, gave that message. And then last week, I preached on God is the God of rest. And in each of these things, as Zach has been on sabbatical, so if you don't know, Zach is our lead pastor. He's actually finishing up his sabbatical this week, so he should be back with us soon. But we're really trying to just pick people who are practitioners within our church that are living this out. And so this week, we're coming to a part of the text where Jesus is inviting in disciples to be with him and really be on an adventure with him. And so we're doing something a little bit different. So we had Heather Mercer, who is a part of our church. She's been a part of this church for a couple years. She's been connected to the Antioch extended church family for a while, but she actually couldn't be with us here live. But we did get a chance to interview her this week hey, we really feel like this is something that's going to bless our church. We want to learn from you. And so what we're going to do is something we've never done before. We've never had a video interview, so this is the first go. And so let's do it. So I love that. We are going to do it because that's what we have planned. But I love the enthusiasm about what we're about to do. So we're going to read this passage, and then we're gonna hear from Heather. And I think there's at least one thing. I think the thing I just want to put before you guys is just asking God, what's one thing you want me to take away from what she has to share? Because she's going to share a lot of her story. So I know that there's going to be a lot of gold to take away this morning. But if you turn with me in your Bibles to Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 12, it'll also be on the screen for you guys. I'm just going to go ahead and read Luke 6, 12 through 19. This is our passage for today. In these days, he, Jesus, went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from the 12, whom he named apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their disease. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. So two things just want to point out before we jump into what Heather has to share. One is just that first portion of Jesus calling his disciples to him. He's calling him to relationship to him. He's also calling them into an adventure. I mean, you look at the characteristics of each of these people. Some of them had titles at the end of their name. Judas was the one I would not want the title of, became a traitor. But, you know, there's different windows, and these people had lives. They had careers. They had businesses. And here's Jesus is calling them in to his adventure. And so that's one thing that we see from this text, and that God's actually doing the same thing to us today. He's calling us into a relationship with him and calling into that adventure. And then the second thing is to see what happens next is that as they go with Jesus, Jesus is healing and he's changing people's hearts and lives. And that's also something that Jesus is offering for us today. It's not, hey, I'm going to be a disciple and I'm going to go do all this cool stuff. It's that I get to walk with him and watch God do it through me and with community, and I get to see him get the glory from that. Does that make sense? So from this interview, we just wanted to kind of highlight that as a theme and just said, Heather, why don't you just share about that? So without further ado, here's the interview with Heather Mercer.
I always thought it'd be great to do like a missionary reality TV show. Like yes. what being a missionary is really like, and turn it into reality TV, it would actually be really good.
Well, Heather, thank you for taking some time to be with us today. We thought it'd be in step with the theme of going on an adventure to Chick-fil-A. Since you couldn't be here with us on Sunday, we wanted to be somewhere where no one else could be on Sunday either, which is Chick-fil-A. So we wanted to start out just by getting to know you. Where were you born?
I was born in Makati Medical Center in Manila, the capital of the Philippines.
Wow.
So until
very
I was 18, I had dual citizenship.
Superhero power, which one would you have if you could have one?
One, okay. So I would want the superpower of being able to heal people 100% of the time.
Wow.
Like anytime that somebody's sick, that they would be made well.
That is a really good answer. I feel bad for mine. I would just want to fly around. So that's really great.
That would be good too.
How many bones have you broken?
I have only broken one bone, thankfully.
Wow.
In the 3rd grade, when I jumped off the jungle gym when the teacher blew the whistle. But I got ice cream sundae out of it,
Okay.
and you know, some popularity the next day at school.
Okay. Next question. How many months have you been imprisoned?
Here in the U.S. or which country? Only outside of the U.S. for a total of 3.5 months, but we might have to save that story for a little bit later.
We'll probably hear more about that. We're going to do a word association. Basketball.
Foul shot.
Okay, all right. Zach Daniel.
Authentic.
Very true. Adventure.
My passion.
Jesus.
Life.
Pineapple.
Mexico.
I should have ended with Jesus. That was really good. Way to go. Great job.
Good job.
All right, I feel like I know you better.
That was pretty adventurous.
Wow. This Sunday, we're coming to the close of our Life of the Party series, and this passage we see that Jesus is spending all night praying, and then he's calling his disciples to himself, and he's calling specifically his apostles, and just this invitation to follow him, this invitation into this like big adventure. And we're just really thankful to get to hear from you because of what God's done in your story and just who you are. But then also there's a lot that you have to offer that we want to glean from in the area of following Jesus and it being about his story and his adventure. Even you not being able to be here with us in person because you're on your adventure. So just to kind of get us started, what was that first invitation like for you to follow Jesus? Kind of those beginning moments, beginning days for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, the journey started, I can look back and recognize God's pursuit of me from the youngest age, but I didn't grow up in a Christian home per se. It was really a culturally Christian home, Christmas, Easter kind of thing, and I actually didn't know who Jesus was or why it mattered. And when I hit my teenage years, our family went through a lot of hardship, a lot of brokenness, and I found myself just on this quest to find out what's the point of life, because if this is what life is all about, then I don't know that I'm interested, And I started seeking out who is God in lots of different places, lots of different world religions, and I remember I met my first Christian friend in high school, and she had been praying for me for years to know Jesus. And she would invite me to go to church, and I would when I didn't have anything else to do. And I went one night, it was November 13th of 1992, and a man preached the gospel, very plain and simple. And I just remember listening to him and thinking, if what he says is true, then Jesus is the answer to all of my unanswerable questions.
Wow.
And so that was really where the journey started in the early days. I decided I was going to follow him, and I didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't know that Jesus was coming back. I didn't know that there was an Old Testament, a New Testament. I mean, I had pretty much zero foundation, and I just was hungry to know who he was. I went and bought my first Bible at a bookstore, and I would sit up all night sometimes and just read the Bible. And I was amazed at how much life and hope I found in what I read. And I was like, why didn't I hear about this before? And so that was really where it started. And I remembered what it was like to be without Christ, and then to have been found by him and be with him. And so I just wanted to tell everybody that would stop long enough to listen, who he was and what he'd done in my life. And so
you're experiencing a lot of this life that you're like you're talking about. You're digging into the Word and talking to anyone who listen about him. So it's maybe those next few steps, like what was that like for you?
Yeah, so when it came time to go to school, I wanted to go to a Christian university, and so that's how I ended up in Waco and Baylor. And I'll never forget, this was like before Antioch as a movement actually officially started. This is when we were, a college group that was meeting in another church, and all the people that I met from this college group were just like lit up for Jesus. And that was really where I started to get a larger global vision. But I can look back and, God's always weaving and writing this tapestry in our lives. And I'd grown up overseas. I'd lived most of my life overseas. Most of my friends were from different countries around the world. So when I started hearing how God was working in countries around the world, it sort of took this upbringing that I had and this new faith that I had found and sort of brought them together. And, I started to hear stories about how what I read in the Bible was actually happening in the corners of the earth. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I can live the pages of this book, that's my best life. And so I started to pray and say, God, what can you do with my life? Is there, here I am, pretty much, send me. And it was kind of middle of college that I learned there was only one Christian worker serving among every 1 million Muslims around the world. And the Lord, basically just spoke to my heart one day, and he said, Heather, how about 1 million Muslims? And I thought, all right, if that can be the leverage point on my life, if I can spend my life to bring 1 million Muslims to Jesus, then I want to sign up for that. And so that's where it started.
Wow. Tell me about kind of that transition. Was that kind of like, well, next step, Afghanistan, or was it, what happened there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for any of us, right, there's an evolution and there's a process. And when I knew that that's what God had called me to, I wanted to get on a plane and go the next day, really. And that was probably one of the early tensions, was letting God do what he needed to do in me so that I could be ready to go do what he'd called me to do. And so it was really a 4-year process from the time I knew God had made the Muslim world kind of that field that he had for me to move into, till actually getting on the threshold of Afghanistan. And, there were a lot of ups and downs in between. I went through the church plant training school, which back then was called ATS. And it was actually the year the Antioch movement formally started, back in 1999, when we were meeting on the parking lot in the front of the old grocery store. And, there were things that would come up along the way that were sort of testing the calling and testing me. At every turn, the Lord just kept saying, this is what I have for you. And I'm blonde hair, blue-eyed, American woman. At the time, I was in my early 20s. I mean, it seemed like the last pick, for Afghanistan. But the Lord reminded me that he delights to use the foolish things of the world and the weak things of the world and the things that aren't to nullify the things that are. And so, a lot of people questioned what I felt like God had called me to do. My family, well-meaning Christians, friends, and so there was a lot of just returning to those stakes in the ground of that season of my life to keep saying, okay, God, this is what you've said, so I'm moving ahead.
Wow. And so then kind of discerning, and I'm sure that there were other people involved in kind of just confirming the, hey, I'm not crazy. I'm going to ATS school, so there's a process of like kind of submitting to leadership, godly leadership in that way. So then once that, this is not going away. This is like, tell us a little bit just about your journey there, kind of leading up to, leading up to the time where you were imprisoned and captivity. Just like, what were you doing?
Life was pretty simple, and I think that's one of the things that I've learned along the way. It's the simple things that often end up being the most powerful in the calling that God gives us. I mean, we were there learning language, living with team and in community, and serving the poor, praying for the sick, and just doing the simple things of the gospel. And every day we would have, dozens of women and children that would come to our door begging for food, looking for work, money, medicine. And it was really just, trying to love and care for the person that was right in front of us in Jesus' name. But I think it was actually, really profound. And that was what was changing lives, was just engaging that person that God would bring our way that day and trying to find practical ways to minister the love of Jesus and then to share with them as we were able to do so, in that sort of hostile environment. And when I left for Afghanistan, I had, bought a one-way ticket. I planned to be there for the rest of my life. I told my parents, if I don't come home, bury me in Afghanistan. I mean, I'd sort of signed the deal on that. And then, 4 months later, after I've moved there, end up in a Taliban prison. And it was sort of like everything that I'd, painted the scenarios for and done the role playing and the training school for, all of a sudden it was real life. Yeah. And I was confronted with, do you really believe what you said you believed before you got on the plane? And, I was barely 24 years old and found out that there were a few cracks in my foundation in terms of, what I really believed about who God is and was. And so it was a struggle. There were a lot of days where, I thought I had been willing to die for the gospel, and then looking at the probability of having to die for the gospel really brought me to my knees. And I think the biggest question that I wrestled with was, God, I know you can get us out, but will you? And I think all of us can relate sometimes in life. Maybe we have a child who's sick, or we have a financial crisis, or our marriage is struggling, and we think, well, God, we know you can, but will you? And really the core question is, God, are you good? No matter what my circumstances tell me. And that was the fight I had to fight, was to get to that place where I said, God, you are good, and it's not a question of whether we live or die. And I'll never forget, and I've maybe told this story before, but we had our Bibles, and all my prayers just felt like they were hitting a glass ceiling. And, I just felt like my ears were deaf and I just couldn't hear God, and he felt like he was a million miles away. And I just opened my Bible because I didn't know what else to do. And it fell open to the passage, Matthew 16, where Jesus is talking to his disciples. And he says, if you save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and my kingdom, you'll find it. And what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And I knew the Lord was saying, Heather, you are trying to save your life. And he was like, are you willing to lose your life? And it wasn't about like physically necessarily losing my life, but Heather, will you give up your will to survive, your will to, have the outcome you want in this situation, and trust me and know that I'm good, because that's who I am. And that was really, the turning point for me, where it broke open the prison of fear that I was in. I wasn't so concerned anymore about what the outcome was, but just that I could hang on to the hem of God's garment long enough to see it out the other side, whatever that looked like.
You're here today, so like, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But yeah, what was it like? How did all that happen? You kind of coming out and just God providing in that way, and yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that part?
Yeah. So, the short version is it was the stuff that movies are made of. It was an action movie in every sense of the word. We were there 105 days. We were interrogated for 3 weeks by 10 to 12 Taliban at a time for 10 to 15 hours a day, put on trial before the Afghan Supreme Court, and we were being charged with a capital crime. And then 9/11 happens, and of course that changed the world, and it radically changed our situation, because we went basically from being religious prisoners to prisoners of war. And so we basically became bargaining chips for the Taliban in this war on terror with the U.S. and coalition. And so, as political and global events started to shift, we were just kind of swirling in that world of chaos. But it's also, I think, what activated the U.S. government and the U.S. military to come up with a plan to rescue us. And, after 105 days, the Afghan Northern Alliance, who were the army opposing the Taliban, invaded Kabul with the support of U.S. coalition. And right before they arrived, the Taliban had taken us out of the city as hostages, piled us into the back of a pickup truck, and we drove through the Tora Bora Mountains of Afghanistan in the middle of the night with all the fleeing Taliban, and ended up several places along the way, but ultimately in another village on the way to Kandahar. And it was our understanding we were being taken to Osama bin Laden. But when we were on the way, we were put into a prison in this village. The U.S. attacked Taliban strongholds in that city, and the Taliban fled. Well, we didn't know what was happening. We just saw the Taliban running away. We could see the bombs falling outside our window. Our building was shaking. We could see the gunfight in the street. And we were just all on our faces just saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Like, fancy praying just goes out the window. And we were just crying out, like, God, do something. And the city quieted down, and about 30 minutes later, we heard a group of men come and try to break down the prison door below us on the first floor. And we could hear mass mayhem, people screaming, running, and we started hearing them run up to the room that we were basically hiding out in. And we all thought, or I thought, this was it. Like, the Taliban are mad, they're coming back, and this is it. I've got 30 seconds. And I remember praying, like, Jesus, if this is it, help us to die honoring you. And I literally thought I was about to see a gun in my face. And right then, this Afghan Rambo looking man comes running in, and he's, got ammunition roped around his neck and an AK-47 and a rocket launcher and hand grenades and 12-year-old little boys who were child soldiers running in off the street. And this man starts yelling, you're free, the Taliban have left and you're free. And we literally just start running away from the prison. And many things transpired, but ultimately we ended up in the hands of local Red Cross. And one of our former Taliban captors, who had turned himself over to the US government, came back in as a double agent, tracked us to this city, and brought us a satellite phone. And we used that satellite phone to call the US government that was waiting in Pakistan. And they sent in 3 Chinook helicopters and 16 special ops soldiers, and they rescued us in the middle of the night from a field.
Crazy. Crazy.
It was crazy.
I mean, that is like straight out of the New Testament, Book of Acts, like a little bit more firepower, but that is wild. And so you thought like this could be it, and then instead you're liberated.
Yes.
You're freed.
That's right.
Wow. I mean, this is like a huge victory for America's still grieving.
Right.
And people have been praying like nonstop, not only in Waco, but like all over the world for y'all.
Yeah, and I think that was, we would get reports from our parents sporadically, and they would say, the world is praying for you, and the world's praying for Afghanistan. I remember we did have one satellite phone call about halfway through our captivity, and one of our German colleagues, her mother said, Germany has not prayed for anything like this since World War II. And it was like we all had this sense that like we're in the middle of history being made for the kingdom in a nation that has so desperately needed a move of God. And when we showed up in Afghanistan, in the late 90s, early 2000, there was the largest known gathering of Christians in all of Afghanistan was 8 people in a country of 26 million. And following the prayer movement that was really ushered in for that nation through that window of time, there are now tens of thousands of believers. And so I think coming back, Dana Curry, my colleague, and I, we both thought like, this story was so much bigger than the 8 of us who happened to be sitting in a prison cell. I mean, it was a story of millions of people and God moving millions of people ultimately to change the history of a nation so that his kingdom could come, because he'd heard for decades the cries of the Afghan people. It was just God.
Yeah. Wow. And so what does adventure look like with Jesus since then? Because there's obviously this amazing story of what God did on a global scale, but I think for some it might be like, okay, that was it, like that. But what does it look like for you since then? I just following Jesus and being on adventure with him.
Right. Yeah, I think early on just deciding and recognizing like God didn't save us from that so we could come home and time out. God saved us from that because there was more work to be done. And, coming out, I said to myself, well, I still want 1 million Muslims. And, so you got to go back. And I think of the scripture that says the giftings and callings of God are irrevocable in Romans. And life circumstance or events don't change the call of God. Its shape and its form may look different in different seasons, but the assignment in my case was still to share the gospel among Muslims. And so Afghanistan was no longer at that time an option. So I started looking at, what was the next best thing, and the war had started in Iraq. And so I decided to hop over there and check it out. And I've said to different people, I've said, Afghanistan was like my first love. It was an obsession. It was a compulsion. Like, I knew I had to go. Iraq was more of an acquired love. I just volunteered. There was a need, there was an opportunity, and so I'm still doing the same thing today in Iraq that we were doing in Afghanistan, 2 decades ago, trying to love people, meet the practical need, and share the hope of Jesus in the midst of that need. And, there are some days that feel very mundane, but then there are a lot of days where it's like, again, living the pages of Scripture and getting to see what we read actually coming to life.
What we've just heard is so rich in a culture where I think comfort and security and a fear of the unknown are just kind of like in the kingdom of the cult. You know what I mean? It's just kind of pervasive, and yet Jesus is calling us to Him and to trust Him. I'd just love to hear if you have any kind of encouragement in that area.
So I've been thinking a lot about lately the truth that to whom much has been given, much is required. And we've been given so much, being born as Americans and all the resources that brings. We are born into freedom. We don't know anything else. We were born into like a cultural freedom, and then as believers, we're born into a new spiritual freedom. And that wasn't just so we could sit at home and enjoy it. It's God has given us the privilege of being American in this country with these freedoms, to have had the opportunity to know Christ, to be found by Him, so that we can go give it away. My Muslim friend, they were born there. They were born a Muslim. They haven't been given the same opportunity. They didn't choose that. They should have that same opportunity that I was given. And so that is something that compels me every day. And I think for all of us to step back and recognize, like, even on the worst day, even when we're struggling in our own need and lack and want, we still have so much more than the rest of the world. And God has blessed us so that we can be a blessing. And I guess the last thing I would say is that, whatever the calling and destiny that God has on someone's life, there are no substitutes for you. If you don't step up into that calling and destiny that God has for you, there's nobody else. There's just you that God has given that to. And so go for it. And I love that the last thing that Jesus said to His disciples is, "Lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the age." And as we go, that's all we need to know.